Hello my friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tiffany, and in today's video we are talking about how I overcame childhood trauma and my tips for addressing mental health and the advice that I would give to friends and family of my own on how to tackle these things so that we can live our very best life. Want to just start by saying there is a content warning here for sure. I'm definitely going to be talking about my own personal trauma, and if that is not something that you feel you are mentally capable of handling at this moment in your life, you are not going to offend anybody by clicking off of this video and skipping this one for sure. I also just want to mention that although I am a licensed mental health professional, I do have my master's degree in counseling, my bachelor's degree in psychology. I am not a medical professional. And if you feel at any time like you need to click out of this video or that you need to seek support for your mental health, I highly recommend that you do so. If you aren't sure what that looks like, you can leave me a comment down in the comment section and I am happy to help. And with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So I feel like I've been talking about doing a video like this for quite some time, and I kind of battled going back and forth about whether or not to do it from the professional standpoint or from the personal standpoint. And I just feel like the way that my channel is, it makes more sense for us to do this from the personal standpoint and for me to share with you a little bit about my trauma history while still being respectful to my friends and family, and also just talking to you about what I have done for myself that's helped me get to this point where I am right now. I feel as though every day I still, am choosing to move past things that have happened to me or things that I've been a part of. But I also feel very much like a healed queen every single day. I can't even begin to tell you what the last year has been like for me, both mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. You know what I mean? My relationship with my husband and my children has just flourished. And I really do feel like I owe a lot of that to tackling my childhood trauma and choosing to rise above it, to forgive, to let go, and to move forward. So let's chat about it. My entire purpose of this video is to bring hope, understanding, and some practical tools to help you or someone you love who might be battling with trauma. I also hope that this helps to normalize the experience. You're not alone. Trauma is a universal experience. Every single person on this planet has experienced trauma of some kind, whether that's personal, firsthand trauma. There's something called an ACE, an adverse childhood experience, and there are, all different types of things that we can experience growing up that might not be the most conducive to healthy upbringings. But then there's also secondhand trauma where maybe someone has gone through something. There is trauma associated with natural disasters. There's, trauma associated with financial crisis, and there's trauma just watching the nightly news. Even if it's not something your personal self are experiencing, but if you're witness to the constant things that are happening in your community or in your area, or even just on this planet to fellow humans, that can also cause a traumatic response within ourselves. Trauma shows up in your life in some sneaky ways sometimes. It shows up in obvious ways like anxiety, right? Depression. Trauma can show up as someone kind of being a recluse or choosing to not be very vulnerable with people, but it can also look like people pleasing, people who are constantly saying they're sorry for things that they shouldn't be sorry for, or for things that don't require an apology. It can show up in anger, right? Where we might have a big reaction, a disproportionate reaction to what's happening to us. It can also show up in our habits on a daily basis. And I'm going to share with you how trauma showed up for me in my daily habits. But the thing to remember about trauma is that it's not what you're experiencing, it's how it was experienced. So every person, and not to get too technical here, but every person on the planet has what's called a schema. That's a big psychology term that basically just means those are the glasses that you wear every day when you interact with the world. And it's how you filter in experiences from other people or conversations or things that you see on social media or television. But it's your life experience. And you can have two people go through the exact same tornado, for example, and they both might be affected differently, and they might respond differently depending on their own personal experience and their own personal schema. So a lot of times people will say, well, that's not how I would react to that, or why are they reacting that way? I wouldn't react that way. And that is such an unfair comment to trauma survivors or people who are experiencing trauma or who have experienced trauma, because it's not about the experience, it's about how the individual is experiencing it. That's something I love to talk to parents about, when I am working with students who have been through something, you know what I mean? The death of a parent or a move or anything like that. It's not about how big the experience is, it's how they experience it. So I would say one of the first things to help overcome trauma is to acknowledge that it exists. And I know that sounds so silly, and it's a little bit of a trope for sure, right? Is, the first way to solve a problem is to acknowledge that there is one, but really honestly, that is the first step. How can you change something if you don't acknowledge that it exists, right? So acknowledge that there's been trauma and validate it, right? Sometimes it's hard to acknowledge childhood trauma because it often happens by someone that we love. And that is definitely a situation for me, you know what I mean? When I was very young, honestly, I don't exactly remember. I'd probably say somewhere around like 7 or 8, I think. Honestly, it's very hazy. But when I was around 7 or 8, I was, and trigger warning, I was touched in an inappropriate way. I'm going to try to use safe words here on YouTube. I was touched in an inappropriate way by the spouse of a family member. This family member is no longer with us on the planet. They've passed away. And, I don't want to throw them like under the bus. It was not their fault. They didn't do it. But they did know that it happened because I did report it. And they told me that I was dreaming and that what I believed had happened did not actually happen. And you probably know this fancy word that you hear a lot of, and that's gaslighting. This is one of those times where it's used properly. I was definitely gaslit by this family member to believe that I dreamt what I experienced. And it took me a long time to, like, years and years, like well into probably my late 20s, to acknowledge that it wasn't a dream, it was real, it was repetitive, and it was habitual, and it was not okay. And it took a long time, but I needed to address the fact that it happened and that it wasn't okay in order to move forward from it. I think the other part of acknowledging your trauma is to give yourself some compassion. A lot of times as humans, our first initial reaction or response is, why did I let that happen? Why didn't I stop it? Why did I put myself in that situation? For women, we often will say to ourselves, what could I have done differently? Why did I wear that outfit? Maybe I was dressed inappropriately. Maybe I shouldn't have talked to that person that way. Maybe I gave them the wrong impression. Somehow we blame ourselves for the victimization that we have experienced, right? And I think that's just the human experience, and trying to feel like we somehow have control over what happened to us, because if we have control over what happened to us, then we can avoid it from happening again, right? We can prevent it. And that is, a shared human experience. It's a coping mechanism a lot of times where we will just tell ourselves that, I could have avoided this situation. So that way, if you're ever faced with that again, you can somehow avoid it. But truth be told, a lot of times it is unavoidable and out of our control. There are so many different coping mechanisms when it comes to acknowledging trauma. For me, when I was younger, it initially started out as perfectionism, where I would try to just be the most perfect version of myself so that I would, win the approval of those around me. That is only one part of my childhood trauma. I also had a very absent father. He was addicted to very heavy drugs at a very young age. He was physically, emotionally, and mentally abusive to my mom. They separated when I was very little, when I was, I think, 2. And it was a very traumatic escape from that situation. And it hurts my soul to think about what my mom went through in that relationship and the courage it took for her to get out of it. And it was kind of like a vow to myself that I would never put myself in a situation like that again, feeling like I could somehow control, my life, that would never, ever, ever happen to me. When the truth be told, you can find yourself in an abusive relationship at any moment in time, and it doesn't always look physical. But he was in and out of my life for a while until I was old enough, around Ryan's age, a little bit younger than Ryan, somewhere around the 2nd grade, where I was old enough to just say, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. And there were very traumatic experiences when I would go to visit him, lots of drug use. He did get remarried. They had children together. Those poor children they ended up being taken by the state and adopted out. I do not have a relationship with them. I don't know where they are. I hope that they are well and living beautiful lives. But that was, very traumatic growing up with an absent father, but also when he was around, it was extremely traumatic. I moved around a lot as a kid, which, sounds like it wouldn't be super traumatic, but it was. I did go to a lot of different schools. It was rare that I returned to the school for the following school year. It wasn't until high school where I actually stayed in one spot for 4 years. And that was just because of my stepdad. He was in the military. We moved a lot. And, I feel like I've taken a lot out of that. I actually feel like that's what's made me such an outgoing and sociable person, because you got to figure it out quickly. Otherwise, you're not going to have any friends, right? But that is pretty traumatic, even if it wasn't meant to be that way. And I think a lot about that, about the trauma that my kids endured moving across the country, and trauma of the pandemic, right? They have their own trauma as well. Even though I do everything I can to keep them protected, they definitely have their own trauma as well. It's just unavoidable. Growing up, I would say that, I was your quintessential teenager with daddy issues. I tried really hard to not go the route of, seeking validation in physical contact, and avoided that for a long time because I didn't want to be a statistic. And I did a pretty good job, I would say. But I feel like I grew up just kind of having an unhealthy relationship with my body because of that. And I hid myself underweight, I would say. I would say that holding on to trauma and not finding a way to let it go, I silently packed on the pounds as a way to kind of just make myself unattractive. Maybe, I was very uncomfortable with talking about, just that whole part of life for a long time. Until I got into a really healthy relationship with my husband. I feel like that really started to heal it. I was super honest with him about all of my trauma. He actually is probably the only person on the planet who knows every single thing that I have been through, that I have experienced. And I feel like I'm the only person that knows all of his as well. And that's okay. You got to have that one person, right? It could be a therapist. It could be, if there's not somebody in your life that you feel comfortable sharing all those things with, you can talk to a perfect stranger who doesn't know anybody in your life, who you're not going to worry is going to share any of that with anybody else. That's always a fear for me. So that was definitely step one in my healing. I would say the biggest thing that's helped me heal, and we're gonna get really raw here, okay? So again, trigger warning. Another trauma that I have been through is I had a late pregnancy miscarriage, and we lost a baby close to the 20-week mark, and it was a missed miscarriage. I have factor V, that's a blood clotting disorder, and there was a clot in the umbilical cord, and so the baby was no longer getting what it needed to survive. And I was given the option to either induce labor or to go through a D&C, and I chose the D&C because there was just no way that I was not strong enough mentally to go through that. So that was very, very, very traumatic. That was probably the hardest time in my marriage. You know, I couldn't get out of bed most days. I was so grief-stricken, and Danny had to like pull up, you know, pick up the pieces and really pull it all in for both of us, which was really, really hard and super unfair. Not uncommon, unfortunately, in situations like that. Of course, we pulled through it because, like the song says, when the bones are good, right, the rest doesn't matter. It doesn't. We pulled through it, but that was extremely traumatic. So I would say probably the most healing thing, and this is totally random and not what I expected to happen, but such a added bonus, was last May of 2024, I had a hysterectomy. Not a total, I did not have a nephrectomy, I just had a hysterectomy, and it was incredibly traumatic. I wasn't prepared for my body's physical response that it was going to have to past childhood trauma. The thought of being unconscious and somebody inside of me that way, because mine was done without surgery, was very, very, very triggering. And I felt out of control. It just made me, I was so angry about it. I remember very vividly, Danny had a physical very shortly after I had my hysterectomy, and he came home and told me he didn't even have to change into his gown, and that, you know, there was no checking of his, you know, areas, bathing suit areas, if you will, as I say with my students. And I was like, are you kidding? Because as a woman, like, I feel like there's always somebody checking in there, and it never just belongs to me. And I was like beyond infuriated. I remember crying, like totally just, again, an irrational response and a disproportionate response, but a response nonetheless. And I let myself feel it. And I, as a mental health provider, decided I needed to address it and dig a little deeper. Like, why was I having that kind of response? And what could I do about it, right? And I did discover that it was because of the childhood violation that I had been through. And I went for my 6 or 8 week follow-up appointment after the surgery. And I remember my doctor saying to me, well, that's it, Tiffany. You're done, you know, with these type of exams. You don't have to have any more of these. You don't have to have annual or every 3 years. You don't have to have any more of these types of exams because you're done. You're done with all of that now. And I was like, wait, what? You mean nobody gets to go inside of there unless I give them permission now? Like, how empowering. So empowering. And I know that sounds crazy, but it was so empowering for me that my body was fully my own. No more children, no more breastfeeding, no more pelvic exams, like no more of all of that. That was all over. And, you know, my body was mine. And that was so freeing, so liberating. And I feel like that really helped me just skyrocket into healing. And it was incredible, just mind-blowing. And I know that that is a giant thing that not everybody can experience, especially, you know, if you don't have a medical reason to go through that. But I think that there's something to be learned there, to remember that you are ultimately in control in the long run, no matter what. And reminding yourself of that, I think, is going to help heal. So there are tons of different ways that you can address trauma. Obviously, you can have trauma therapy that is extremely beneficial, especially the closer to the traumatic incident that you get your therapy, the quicker and maybe more beneficial it will be. It will be easier to create healing habits when it's closer to the time of the event. However, that doesn't mean that if it has been 20 years that you wouldn't benefit from therapy, because you can benefit from therapy forever. Even if you feel like you're healed, you can benefit absolutely from therapy. There's also lots of different types of therapy that are helpful for trauma, EMDR, CBT. I'm not going to get into all of those because I want you to do your own research, but there's so many great ways of handling trauma through therapy. Another great option is journaling. You can do it, old school style, where you're just writing down your thoughts, getting your thoughts out on paper, out of your body. You know what I mean? In my office as a school counselor, I have a worry monster where kids can write down their worries and they feed it to the monster and they zip his mouth closed. And we talk about how you can't have the worry and the monster, right? One of you has to take ownership of it. And giving it to that monster is giving it away so that you can release it. That's kind of the premise behind journaling as well. Also, there's a ton of great journaling prompts. You can go on to Google. You can even ask ChatGPT to help you with a journaling prompt, a trauma healing or trauma related journaling prompt. And those can be very, very helpful as well, just to help you with a jumping off point. If you're not the type to just kind of write what's in your mind, a prompt can be very helpful. You also need to find a way to set boundaries. So boundaries are really hard for humans, especially humans with trauma. The boundary gets very, very blurry. And I know for me, I didn't have a lot of boundaries for a while, and I can be an oversharer. Part of ADHD is sometimes being impulsive in what you say, and I can be an oversharer sometimes, I'm aware. But setting boundaries with not just people, right? But also with the type of content you're willing to consume. I used to watch a lot of crime documentaries, and I refuse now. It's a boundary I've had to set for myself because I've discovered that is incredibly traumatic and it wasn't helpful at all. I think sometimes we don't realize how triggering shows that we watch, movies that we watch, the news, friends, conversations, that kind of stuff. So setting boundaries for those things as well is really important. There's also something to be said about kind of reparenting yourself. I know that sounds like a weird phrase, but basically what that just means is that you're putting your needs first. And as a mom, we're often taught that we have to take care of everybody else first. It's very hard to put our own needs first, right? However, if you don't address your own needs and you let them go, they will not be met, right? Because you're not making them a priority. You're saying to yourself and to the world, you're not as important as everyone else. So making yourself a priority is super duper important. And finally, you got to get community support. That could look like safe people in your community who have been through trauma. So maybe it's a support group. It could look like friends. It could look like family. But finding a community of people could look like church, whatever that looks like for you. But finding a community of people that you can rely on and lean on when you have tough days, because you will have tough days. Even as a healed person, you will have tough days. And we are not designed as humans to do this whole thing alone. So make sure that you have a community of support when you need it. And then there's daily tools, right? For me, I use a lot of grounding techniques, so a lot of deep breathing, a lot of visualization. So if I'm about to go into something that I know is going to be anxiety provoking or even possibly triggering for me, I will do a grounding technique where I literally take my shoes off and my socks, and I imagine my feet are growing roots and they are digging into the ground. And I am literally wrapping those roots around the other roots that are in the ground. And I am securing myself like an anchor to the ground, literally grounding, so that no matter what I am about to experience, I know it's not going to move me, that I am good, I am solid, and I'm not going to be moved. That's one type of grounding technique. There are other types of grounding techniques where, you know, you're naming things. If you start to feel yourself having like a little bit of a panic attack, you can look for 5 things that, you know, just name 5 different things. You can focus on things that you hear, just, you know, your own personal current experience. There is a gnat, oh my gosh. Daily affirmations are great, right? Looking yourself in the mirror every day and saying the things that you need to hear. I like the fun ones. I see them on TikTok all the time that are like, hey, you super fine baddie, but they use a lot of swear words. Those are my kinds of affirmations. I love ones like that are like, yeah, you're badass. You can do anything. Like, I love that stuff. I listen to those all the time. They're fun. I love to share them. I love to share them with other people. I follow a ton of like saying Instagram accounts that put out a lot of affirmations. I just think that they're so powerful. And then the final thing I would say about daily habits is to just be consistent and give yourself some grace, because healing takes a lot of time. I'm 41 and I'm finally feeling like I'm healing, but it takes a long time. It is a process, and just like in any other, you know, project process, you're going to have a step forward and 2 back, and another step forward and 2 back, and that's just kind of how it goes. That's okay. That's all right. Just like with sobriety, just like with, you know, any other thing that you are tackling, you got to give yourself some grace, stay consistent, give yourself patience, and you'll get through it. I read a quote a long time ago that stuck with me and still sticks with me, and I say it to my students all of the time. I probably tell somebody this quote every single day, and that is that you have survived 100% of your worst days. And to just remind yourself of that your batting average is amazing, right? And your wins are 100%. You've never lost. You always win. You always come out on top, and you will continue to. I often tell my students to look for evidence in the things that they believe. So if they believe that they are not capable of something, I always say, what evidence do you have to show that? And most of the time they can't find any, right? But can we find evidence of all the good things? We absolutely can. So finding the evidence, remembering that we have survived 100% of our worst ever days, and we will continue to do that. Your past does not define your future, right? That is, again, something I feel like is a trope. We hear it all the time, but it's the truth. You can move past what has happened to you. You can reinvent yourself. You can start over every single morning. And remember that what happened to you is not your fault, no matter what. Even if you have tried really hard over the years to figure out what you could have done differently so that it never happens to you again, it's not your fault. It never was your fault, and it never will be your fault. And it's okay to let that go and to move forward. I would love to hear what you guys do or have done or are currently doing to battle, trauma in your life, whether that's childhood trauma or trauma you've endured as an adult or trauma you're currently enduring. If there is a prayer that we can pray for you, I'd love to hear that down in the comments section. If you need support from me, let me know. If you don't know where to turn, let me know. It's as simple as doing a Google search in your area, to find somebody nearby, but you don't have to do it by yourself. We're all here together. We have such a wonderful community here at Charlotte Grove Farmhouse. If you're not subscribed, I'd love to have you subscribe because I really have enjoyed bringing in this mental health bucket to my channel and talking more about mental health. I feel like we need to do more of that. I follow this content creator on TikTok. And he talks a lot about men's mental health, and he is sober, and he's talked a lot about his sobriety journey. And I applaud him so much for being a strong male figure talking about mental health, because you don't see enough of that. And I feel like this next generation is doing such a good job at normalizing, mental health help. And treating mental health just like dental health and physical health and eye health and any other kind of health, right? Not necessarily waiting until there's a problem, but what can you do to keep it healthy? And I love that. And if you know somebody who you feel could use a little support through some trauma healing, feel free to share this video with them, and or resources. I'll have links for you down below as well, so that if you need immediate support, you can get it. But yeah, that's where we're at. I am feeling very healed. And I'm trying to keep it that way, just taking really good care of myself, really good care of my mental health, working out, taking care of my physical health has been tremendous in my mental health as well. So absolutely thankful for that. And I'm thankful for all of you. And you guys are so incredible. You're so supportive for the most part. You know what I mean? We have such a great community here. And hopefully you enjoyed this video. A little bit vulnerable, a little bit different than what we've been through before, but I know you guys are here for it. And I know so many of you are dealing with the same experiences. And like I said, 100% of the human race has experienced trauma at one point in their life. So hopefully you got something out of this, whether that's hope or a strategy, or you want to reach out to someone you know in your life. I'm here for all of it. So thank you guys so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, my friends.